You're hearing the voices of anti-mask protesters outside of a Tennessee school board meeting in August 2021. They're chanting, "We will not comply," and "No more masks," in response to public officials considering a mask mandate in schools now that the Delta variant is surging just as schools reopen and classes resume. Resistance to masks and vaccines has pushed the number of hospitalizations and deaths upwards again, and this time we're seeing more children becoming ill.
A vocal contingent has politicized public health measures, often using questionable information gathered online or even conspiracy theories to discredit vaccines, masking, and other public health measures that prevent illness and limit the pandemic's spread. Some Republican governors, those in Texas, Florida, Arizona, and other states, have gone so far as to outlaw mask mandates, with penalties for local governments and schools that do not comply. The assault on science has become central to the truth divide in our country. It's turning citizens against each other, and it's threatening our democracy.
What is the role of science in a democracy? As the pandemic regains intensity in its second year, what are the stakes of the truth divide for the health of our nation? I'm Tracy Fessenden.
And I'm John Carlson.
And this is Recovering Truth, a podcast from Arizona State University's Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict in partnership with the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. We're joined today by Evan Berry and Ben Hurlbut to discuss science, anti-science, and democracy. Evan Berry is a fellow in the Recovering Truth Project and an assistant professor of environmental humanities in the School of History, Philosophy, and Religious Studies at ASU. Benjamin Hurlbut is a historian of modern biomedical and life sciences and an associate professor in the School of Life Sciences at ASU. Welcome to you both.
Wonderful to be here.
Thank you for having me.
So President Biden came into office saying he would, quote, follow the science. This was after former President Trump repeatedly undermined science, at one point boldly contradicting and cutting off one climate change expert by insisting, quote, science doesn't know that. Are these the only two ways to think about science? Science either knows or science doesn't know. Evan.
I don't think scientific certainty is the right way to think about how policies are implemented. Science helps suggest what courses of action may or may not be effective, and it gives us information about really big picture questions like climate change or global pandemics. But it's not a black and white issue in terms of what that means and in terms of how policy should work. So I think following the science is already a set of conversations about how scientific information is taken up by publics, operationalized as policy, and shared in the public sphere.
There seems to be a strange reification of science going on both sides. When people say they believe science or they don't believe science, it seems that science is made out to be some strange entity that may not really characterize the way we ought to be thinking about science. Ben, what's your take?
I mean, I think that that's exactly dead on. Science is not singular. Science is a social institution. It's a set of practices. It's heterogeneous. It's evolving. It's always incomplete. And one of the things that it does is contend with the forms of uncertainty and processes for arriving at greater certainty within, the domain of issues of knowledge, of technical knowledge. And I think that Evan is exactly right. The idea that we follow the science is actually, you might say, a kind of a theory of policy or even a political theory. It's an idea of how and on whom a democratic polity ought to rely in order to make judgments about what it should do. But the notion that by following the science, you know what to do is false. It's a displacement of political judgment onto an institution that A, is not an institution capable of rendering those forms of political judgment, even though in times it does, and B, one that is imbued with a kind of authority because you attribute to it a false certainty, a false univocality, a sort of notion that science knows, and because science knows, that all that we need to know is known. We know what we should do because science knows. But there's sort of leaps in there that take you from, you might say, questions of fact to questions of values.
So it seems that some people who are anti-science, or we might think that they're anti-science, are perhaps really anti-scientist. That is, they think scientists are untrustworthy or partisan elites. What do you think there, Evan?
Climate scientists are just perpetually harassed online. Epidemiologists, the same. And that anger and frustration about science is sometimes directed at scientists. But I think the underlying issue is that the basic claims to knowledge laid out by science as an institution are taken exception to, that those are incompatible with whole modes of political life. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that there isn't consensus around something like the reality of COVID-19 or the veracity of anthropogenic climate change. Those are relatively strong domains of scientific knowledge. The questions are about what it means then to follow them. So the problem I think you're pointing to, John, when you ask about anger towards scientists, is around how that gap between the sort of basic knowledge claims being put forward by science as an institution and their incommensurability with other positions that increasingly large swaths of, especially the American public, hold to.
We have a clip that I want to play. It's an exchange between Republican Representative Jim Jordan and Dr. Anthony Fauci. It gets to, I think, some of the kinds of issues that we're addressing. Let's listen to the clip.
What metrics, what measures, what has to happen before Americans get their freedoms back?
My message, Congressman Jordan, is to get as many people vaccinated as quickly as we possibly can, to get the level of infection in this country low, that it is no longer a threat. That is when. And I believe when that happens, you will see.
What determines when?
I'm sorry.
What measure? I mean, are we just going to continue this forever, or when do we get to the point? What measure? What standard? What objective outcome do we have to reach before Americans get their liberty and freedoms back?
You know, you're indicating liberty and freedom. I look at it as a public health measure to prevent people from dying and going to the hospital.
You don't think Americans' liberties have been threatened the last year, Dr. Fauci? They've been assaulted. Their liberties have.
I don't look at this as a liberty thing, Congressman Jordan.
Well, that's
I look at
obvious.
this as a public health thing.
So that was Representative Jim Jordan and Dr. Anthony Fauci. Their exchange pits individual freedom and rights in opposition to public health. They are clearly talking right past each other. Representative Jordan was accusing Fauci of weaponizing science towards anti-democratic ends and the protection of basic individual rights. So Ben, let me start with you. Do you think science can be at odds with democracy? Is the Constitution being suspended during this pandemic and the public health measures that are required to get out of it?
So, I mean, I think reifying science and democracy as those somehow separate but coming into contact in moments like this is a misrepresentation. Public health is always political, right? I mean, it's always a question of the extent to which constraints are placed on people's movements, on people's behavior, indeed on people's bodies, in the name of the public's health. I mean, there is intrinsically a tension in public health between the population and the individual. Public health is always political. The way in which that mask has become emblematic of the sociopolitical authority of science to place constraints upon people, and how that stands in relation to other forms of authority, including the sort of the notion of the sovereignty of the individual to, control their own bodies and behaviors. And that is a kind of site of politics which takes the form that it takes because it becomes a politics of truth. Not a politics of truth in the sense of, politics of truth versus falsity, but a politics of truth in the sense of who lays claim to truth, whose truth rules, and what counts as that truth.
Evan, what goes through your mind when you hear that exchange between Jordan and Fauci?
What's interesting here is that we're framing the question as if science somehow can be at odds with democracy or encroach on democracy, as if what we mean by democracy or freedom are indeed self-evident. And it doesn't seem to me at all like they are. Jordan, in his own performative way, is tracing a set of links between the fundamental rights to assembly and civic participation and bodily integrity to being asked to wear a mask. I wonder if the same kinds of logic would apply when his next door neighbor is playing super loud music at 3 a.m, or if someone was smoking on the sidewalk right next to where he was eating dinner. We have regulations about these kinds of public health and sort of public nuisance questions that don't grant unlimited personal choice as the measure of freedom. So what's interesting here is that it's actually the concept of freedom that's being sort of radically enlarged, and not what we mean by science.
We know that historically certain uses of science have been highly undemocratic and discriminatory to certain groups of people. The eugenics movement in the United States or the Tuskegee experiments show us what looks like social consensus, grounded at the time in scientific knowledge, can in fact do extraordinary harm. So that might be seen to put us in a bind. We have to reckon the unethical aspects of scientific research, but also realize the potential of science to contribute to public health, the public good. Thoughts on that, Ben or Evan?
So I think that it's always a mistake to think of science as somehow outside of a social milieu, and every once in a while it gets contaminated by racism or by some prejudice or whatever, but that otherwise it's pure. The kind of purity that we ask for, I mean, what do we need to know? So Fauci says, we need to get the rate of infection down. So he's looking at epidemiological numbers. He's looking at case counts, right? He's not asking questions about the spin-off, very significant public health consequences of an economic lockdown, of social isolation, of truncation of education, of a whole range of other things that could be included in a kind of public health calculus, even a kind of a technocratic one. Those are political judgments. Those are value-laden judgments. The eugenics project in early 20th century America was a public health project. It emerged out of the invention of public health. You can say, well, that wasn't really science, and therefore that wasn't really public health, that was politics. No. It was a moment in which there was a project of kind of social rationalization, progressive era social rationalization that drew upon technocratic authority, that drew upon science. I think one has to see these things as within a kind of political milieu and ask, what is good science in relation to that political milieu, not as though it's something that can be answered independently of it and then will solve the problem of politics automatically, directly as a result.
Yeah, I mean, I think about how different constituencies, different kinds of different nations, different societies imagine the future. So I'm thinking specifically about, again, climate change. If the idea about politics is simply a sort of atemporal notion of freedom, that you should be able to drive and travel and fly and do as you wish around everything, you should be able to eat as much beef as you want. If that's sort of the vision of what the good life and a properly organized polity involves, then of course any scientific information about a future where those things are problematic is going to seem political and objectionable. If you want to be able to move through the world without any inconvenience of any kind, and science is a source of information that informs you that that's always already an impossibility, you're going to feel frustrated with science.
We know that many who oppose masks and vaccines claim to have done their own research and have found science, or what they what they pull out as science to support their positions. So even among those who seem to be anti-science, there's still an appeal to scientific language. But we also see an appeal to religious language, or the language of deeply held belief, particularly as more people seek exemptions for the vaccine. But if my deeply held belief is that the earth is flat, I'm not likely to cause harm to my neighbor. Whereas if my deeply held belief is that I should be exempt from the vaccine because it has microchips in it, I may well cause great harm. So how much respect should be accorded to these deeply held beliefs that take on a kind of religious character? Evan, let's start with you.
Yeah, we could do a whole episode of a podcast on the category belief, which is an incredibly loaded and difficult term. Belief and opinion are not the same thing. And again, I'm thinking about the words I have in my head are around flattening and leveling, right? That there is a flattening of the epistemic landscape that we live in which a Journal of American Medicine study and what Frank on Facebook said are taken as being on the same plane. And likewise, the formal position of the Catholic Church on an issue and an individual person's non-doctrinal, non-shared, ahistorical view that vaccines have microchips in them are both examples of the category belief. And so that sort of total flat, I mean, the exemptions carved out in American legal history around religion, say, for instance, around issues of involuntary conscription or vaccination or other things, are almost always adjudicated on matters of whether or not those quote unquote sincerely held beliefs are not just inventions of the individual, but are in fact demonstrable categories of religious identity that endure for a community of people over time. And that's not what we're seeing here at all.
So on one of the few trips that I took in the last 18 months, I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I saw a yard sign that said simply, "In Fauci we trust." And I think there are two things that are interesting in there, right? I mean, there is a sort of secularization of divine authority, and you might say the divination of a particular individual secular authority, but also the word trust. And there's been much hand-wringing about trust and distrust, the distrust in real science. Anti-science is an expression of distrust in real science. But I think, Tracy, as you were pointing out absolutely correctly, the battlefield is a kind of credibility battlefield. And it's not that you're pro-expert or anti-expert, it's that you're pro these experts versus pro those experts. You marshal your counter-experts to speak to those experts. And I think that we make a mistake by saying, well, we need to restore trust. I mean, trust is the word that we use to describe social relations that have stabilized into expressions of deference, where those with outsized authority are seen as rightly having that outsized authority. That's how it should be. And so in Fauci we trust, which is a kind of a rebuke to those who don't trust Fauci, is I think there's a lot going on in those very few words that speak to the kind of pathologies of American political culture, pathologies that I think are profoundly exacerbated actually by deploying labels like anti-science, by putting up yard signs that say science is real, et cetera, because it pretends as though there's no politics in that declaration. And yet precisely what's at question is, what kind of politics do we want? What are the right ways of organizing ourselves as a political collective in which we authorize and rely upon particular forms of epistemic authority to do the work of or contribute to the work of governing as appropriate and that are held to account.
There's a bit I'd like to supplement this exchange with that I think we'd be remiss if we didn't make sure to get it into the conversation. The sort of frame of the questions and last couple of rounds of conversation have really been around science as an institution and the frustrations around its hierarchical claims to authority and the breakdown of relationships of trust between democratic publics and scientific knowledge in the United States in its own peculiar way. But the piece I'd want to add is around what is the counterforce to that? Who are we talking about as challenging those relationships of trust? And in my own remarks, labeling that as a kind of leveling, or thinking about medical freedom and individual people scouring the internet for information that confirms their biases about the dangers of the vaccine, et cetera, we imagine that what we're talking about is individual persons who are private, legitimate participants in the American democratic enterprise. But we're forgetting about where the information is coming from. This is not just a bunch of autonomous folks exchanging ideas in a free marketplace called Facebook. The civic space in which information is being traded involves corporate technology companies that are providing algorithms that drive particular kinds of messages to particular kinds of groups of people. We're talking about streams of knowledge that come directly from both political parties, powerful stakeholders, both inside and outside the United States. And so this is hardly, as I put it earlier, like a flat landscape of information. It's definitely built around sources of authority and claims to legitimacy. And so we're not just talking about science as a kind of knowledge formation that particular swaths of the public hold faith in vis-a-vis a totemic relationship with someone like Dr. Fauci, but also other kinds of strange totems, the symbol of masks as tyranny, memes that are generated out of bot farms in Siberia. I mean, we live in genuinely uncharted territory here, where it's not just about science versus individual autonomy, but really around information and disinformation competing for people's attention.
So I have to just add one thing to that as well. Agreeing with all of that, we also have to remember, I think very importantly, the sort of reception side of that equation. So just as pre-existing conditions in people's bodies rendered them vulnerable to COVID, so too pre-existing conditions in the body politic rendered us vulnerable to the forms of information production that Evan is speaking about. And I think that assaults of that sort can bounce off a healthy body politic. And so we ought not make the mistake of merely looking outward and saying, well, if we can just control the information, then we will get the right kind of politics. No, if we get the right kind of politics, we will control the information.
Absolutely true.
So we only have a minute or two left here. Let me close by asking a question about where we go from here. Ben, you've written that one way to move forward is making science more attentive to citizens' real concerns, making citizens smarter about how science works in governance, and making spaces for deliberating different interpretations of science without polarizing conflicts. It's a very constructive set of ideas there and proposals. Evan, what would you say that we need to do to think about moving forward?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think both sides of the equation that Ben just raised, in terms of combating disinformation, but also thinking about what are the social and cultural causes of skepticism around vaccines, public health regulations, climate change. How might we move forward in terms of identifying a common body politic, in terms of shared futures, what those shortcomings are? I would tend to think that the susceptibility to disinformation, or the propensity to be mistrustful of hierarchical forms of knowledge or expertise, come out of some sort of alienation from meaningful participation in the body politic. I think part of that has to do with race and class in the United States. We can see white male alienation from the control of the levers of power as being a site of the anxieties that produce this kind of skepticism and opposition. And I think tackling that head on is definitely in our future if we want to think seriously about continuing to build and collaborate as a nation on issues like public health and environmental well-being.
Yeah, I mean, I agree very much with Evan. I mean, rather than doubling down on appeals to facts, we have to see the problem as essentially one of allocating voice, right? Which is the arena in which questions of credibility, but also of legitimacy arise and get hashed out in the public sphere. So, what people and institutions should be treated as legitimate representatives of the voice of science and under what conditions? Who's entitled to speak for, and with the voice of dissent and on what grounds? If we sort of treat the truth card as the solution to the problem and suggest that science has a monopoly on the truth card, we have in effect truncated a politics of persuasion, where persuasion is precisely what's at stake here. The capacity to persuade one's fellow citizens that this is what we should care about, this is how we should live, this is what should be done and why.
Ben Hurlbut, Evan Berry, thank you so much for being with us. We're so grateful to you for this rich discussion. I'm Tracy Fessenden.
And I'm John Carlson. This podcast is part of the Recovering Truth Project at Arizona State University's Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, in partnership with the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and supported by a generous grant from the Henry Luce Foundation.
Our producer is Sarah Ventry, and our team includes Matt Correa and Sarah Riccardi-Schwartz. Our music is by Ketza.
Recovering Truth is a civic responsibility. Thank you for listening and joining us in this effort.